Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center, and here with me is Todd Myers, our Vice President for Research here at Washington Policy Center. This is the legislative session is over, but we're still coming to you every week just to follow up with the aftermath of the legislative session and to follow through with the bills that the governor signs and any other actions that the governor takes during the legislative session. So today we'll be speaking with, of course, Todd Myers, as well as our Center for Transportation Director, Charles Prestrude. He'll be coming up in the second half of the program to talk about, take an in-depth dive into the transportation budget as we talked about last week. But let's get started with Todd. Todd, one of the things that you've been talking about this session, one of the things you've been tracking is, of course, the big tax increases. Where do we stand so far on that?
So ultimately, it could have been worse. They increased taxes by just under $10 billion, still the largest tax increase in the state history. So when I say it could have been worse, it still was very bad. They did not do the wealth tax, the innovation tax. Basically, if you were successful, if you created a company, let's say, that rhymes with Microsoft or something, and had success and put equity into it, they did not pass the tax on that wealth that you earned. However, what's interesting is that although that did not make it in the final budget, the state Senate on the final day passed a version of that tax, but never sent it over. It never went over to the House. So the House didn't even take it up. I think they were already in sine die and drinking or something. I don't know. But what's interesting about that is that even though they knew it probably would not pass, probably would not go through the House, they still created a statement that they wanted to do it. They want to tax people who have generated wealth, people who have innovated and things like that. And so while Amazon, Microsoft, I mean, all of the companies that have really driven Washington's economy over the past few decades sort of breathed a minor sigh of relief at the end of the session. There was a definite shot across the bow that they are still they're still a target on them for next session. The other taxes that were passed, a variety of small taxes that kind of, death by 1,000 cuts to different companies, removing lower tax rates that had been in there for different industries and increasing them. So it's going to hit a wide range of people, including the tech industry. A form of the tax that had taken effect in Seattle, on business and occupation tax, a head tax, that sort of thing, a form of that was passed. That's the biggest tax increase, I think, by amount. And what was so interesting is that earlier this year, if you remember, the city of Seattle actually argued, hey, we're not making as much from this tax as we thought. And the reason is businesses left Seattle. And so the same type of tax that caused businesses to leave Seattle, the state said, whoa, but if we pass it at the state, it won't cause problems, right? No, it's going to cause problems, of course. So it's very expensive legislative session, a big increase in the budget. And just a reminder, you will hear all this time that there was a shortfall, that there was a $16 billion deficit or a shortfall, and we needed to increase these taxes. That's absolute nonsense. As we showed in our report card for Washington's future, Washington's state budget has increased by more than 50% above inflation and population over the past 10 to 12 years. So huge increase in budget spending, huge increase in revenue, and yet even that was not enough to prevent the legislature from passing the largest tax increase in state history.
One of the things that I've noticed with like some of my representatives are on the left side of things, well, all, and and the argument is, well, the taxes that were increased are not the kinds of taxes that are going, they're not the types of taxes that are going to impact, the common consumer. Yeah. These are taxes that are targeted toward the ultra wealthy that can afford to pay more. They're not going to charge the common person more. How do you see that?
That's nonsense. In fact, while that, like I said, some of the biggest taxes were on businesses, but like that, the money that goes to those taxes doesn't go to business, doesn't go to innovators, and it still hits a lot of businesses. Plus, there were lots of other increases that hit everybody. Most notably, a 6 cent per gallon gas tax increase that hits everybody. There was also increases in a lot of little fees, such as, if you want to buy a Discover Pass and go hiking in Washington State parks, that price went up. Now, that's relatively small, but the problem is that the way they did part of this is that they increased lots of little fees, lots of little taxes, all of which hit working families, small businesses, things like that. So the notion that this isn't going to hit the average family is just absolute nonsense. And of course, this comes on top of, we still have the CO2 tax that's still going up. As we pointed out, the last auction for CO2 permits, the price was higher than even the highest price projected by the Department of Ecology. So you still have that. And then you have other regulations that are going to increase the cost of energy and fuel, notably the low carbon fuel standard, which hadn't been adding very much to the cost of gasoline, about a penny or even less than a penny, was strengthened because it wasn't generating enough revenue for the industries that lobbied for it, foreign oil companies, other folks like that. And so that was strengthened. And so what would have added maybe a couple of cents per gallon next year is now going to add like 7 cents per gallon. And then, I think like 15 cents a gallon the year after that. So those sorts of things all hit average people. Again and again, this claim that, oh, no, we're trying to make our system more progressive, tax the wealthy, not the poor, not the working classes. That's nonsense. Somehow it always, the way that they make the system more progressive is never by cutting taxes for working families. It's always by raising taxes on others and then saying, well, but we raise taxes on everybody else by less. So the common denominator is that the people always pay more and government always gets more.
Yeah, and the other thing, we'll get into more of this with Charles, but one of the things that I talked about over the weekend with some people was the increase of the diesel tax. And of course, ask any trucker, absolutely everything that you buy is trucked at some point, which is going to raise the price of all goods.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I mentioned the 6 cent per gallon gas tax. It's 12 cents a gallon for diesel, and everything that is shipped, that goes into everything, the cost of everything that we see. So, I think that's one of the things that, unfortunately, in case with the low carbon fuel standard, with the diesel tax, most people don't see the diesel tax because very few people have diesel vehicles, but truckers see it. And so those costs do, have an impact on overall prices, but politicians can claim, oh, that's not us. That's Donald Trump. That's tariffs. That's, inflation. That's, sunspots, something like that, but it's not us. It's not the fact that we raise taxes by nearly $10 billion is not why you end up paying.
Now, you touched on this already with the actions of the Senate at the last minute, passing this tax that they knew wasn't going to go anywhere for all intents and purposes, but they're sending that signal that that's what they want. What about the other taxes? We started with a potential of a $21 billion or so tax increase. The governor was saying, look, much to the chagrin of many of his legislative leaders, he was saying, look, there's reckless spending going on in Olympia. We gotta put a halt to that, or at least put some brakes on it. Right. We'll see how many of those brakes are applied, but they end up with a $9 billion. They still end up with the largest tax increase in history, even after taking away over half of what was originally proposed. How many of these other bills do you see, of these other proposals, do you see coming back the next time around?
Quite a few, because I think that the argument, like I said, you get a couple of arguments for why we need tax increases. One, we have to fund all these programs. Oh my God, we don't have enough money. We need more funding. That's, as we pointed out, that's ludicrous. State budget has massively increased above inflation and the rate of population over the past 10 to 12 years. The other argument that you get is that we need to make the system more progressive, right? We need to tax the rich, not the poor. Again, if they really wanted to do that, they could find ways to cut taxes. They could cut sales taxes. Sales taxes, as a relative in terms of their impact on income, hit working families, middle-class families more than they hit wealthy families. So if you want to do that, you could cut sales taxes. Guess what? They didn't cut sales taxes. So, they don't do those things. But what it ends up being is that what you see is one of the justifications for these taxes is not, hey, we need to fund this program, or we need, to fill a gap. It is simply vindictiveness. And the best example of that is the Tesla tax. So Washington State has a system where we have to sell, where 35% of passenger vehicles next year have to be electric vehicles. Now, one of the ways that they deal with that, because they know that they're not going to hit that target, we're at about 22% now. So they say, oh, don't worry about it. Even if we don't meet the target, what can happen is that Tesla, because 100% of its vehicles are electric, they generate what are called credits. So a company like Honda, which basically sells 0 electric vehicles, can purchase credits from Tesla to meet that target. So this trading system is actually a good part, right? People are skeptical of a lot of these things, and I understand why, but this is actually good. It makes it more flexible. I think the targets are completely ludicrous, but if you're going to set a target, having some flexibility in trade like this is good. So this is critical to rewarding companies who go above and beyond, who sell more electric vehicles, right? They not only get to sell the vehicles, but they also get rewarded for beating the targets. So what did the legislature do? Punish Tesla, right? You've done too well at meeting our targets, at doing the very thing that we said that we wanted you to do by generating these credits, and taxed Tesla only. So they said, any auto manufacturer that has more than this amount of credits, you now get taxed for every single one of those credits. It is purely vindictive. It is purely about punishing Elon Musk and Tesla because they are angry at Tesla and angry at Elon Musk for supporting Donald Trump. So, like, what's the result of this? The result, obviously, is to undermine a system that they say they want. But because there has now been a backlash against Tesla, independent of this, the share of electric vehicles in Washington State that were Tesla, that are new vehicles that are sold that are electric vehicles that are Tesla, went from about 50% in January to about 35% in March. And as a result, the percentage of total of all vehicles that are electric went down as well. So, like, they are shooting themselves in the foot. Tesla is by far the #1 electric vehicle company in both the nation and Washington State. And so this attack on Tesla is undermining the state's ability to sell electric vehicles. The number of electric vehicles get sold. And so again, when given a choice between this principle, this high-minded principle that they say that we must fight climate change, we must have more electric vehicles, and vindictiveness, they won't win vindictiveness.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because there's been so much talk about there's an existential crisis afoot.
Yeah.
The very planet is at stake. And you hear it, I mean, this is not a one-time, one-off assertion. You have new polls showing that young people don't want to have children because they're so afraid of the existential crisis of climate change coming that, young couples are saying, well, the world's gone to hell in a handbasket. We can't risk it. And yet, apparently, we have this existential crisis. The entire planet and every living thing is at stake. But if I disagree with the politics of Elon Musk, I should give up on trying to make this difference. Or his difference that he's creating doesn't count because they don't like his politics in these other smaller areas. I just find that hypocrisy and that values, the prioritization of the values there to be astonishing in many ways.
Well, and this session on climate policy, I mean, Washington, we constantly are told, oh, Washington's such a climate leader on climate policy, climate policy. And as I've said a million times, and we need to keep telling people, Washington is missing its climate targets. I mean, we like every year between 2012 and 2023, Washington State CO2 emissions went up every single year except one, and that was the COVID year of 2020. So like our policies are not working, and yet we still pat ourselves in the back for being so conscientious. And the reason that we keep failing is this very contradiction, this hypocrisy of choosing policies that sound good. And yet when push comes to shove, when we get a choice between doing the right thing and reducing emissions and doing something good for the planet, even if it means that our political opponents benefit, to hell with that. We're punishing our political opponents, we're rewarding our political allies, even if it means that at the end of the day, it's completely hypocritical.
Yeah, Time Magazine, I know I sent you this, but I don't know if you looked at it. I had a good chuckle over the weekend because I was going in depth on it, where Governor Inslee got an Earth Award from Time Magazine.
Yeah.
And they listed 3 criteria, and I'll paraphrase, but it was basically, he created more state programs, he created the Climate Commitment Act, which reinvests this money into clean energy,
Yeah.
which I knew you'd enjoy. And the other one was another one of those kinds of, it was an input where it was, he was basically leading on these issues, and yet, here we are. None of them were results. None of them were based on, okay, he did all these things. What did he actually achieve? There wasn't any of that.
And he doubled down on that because he wrote a piece in the Washington Post recently about how climate can be a way for Democrats to appeal to young people. The whole article is about what a salient political weapon climate change can be at appealing to certain groups. There is not a single word in it about how his policies actually reduced CO2 emissions or were effective. So again, that's his mindset, and I think, it is the mindset of many in the sort of progressive environmental movement, which is the focus on the politics, the focus on the symbolism, the focus on punishing the bad people, big oil or the wealthy or things like that, and not actually producing environmental results. And so again, my thing that I keep saying, and I try to get people to believe, is that the best way to help the environment is to give power to individuals, power to people, power to those who actually care about results and want to save money, who want to use less gasoline, less electricity, because it benefits them financially. Give power to local communities who actually care about making sure that the stream through their community, is clean and has fish and does things like that. Look to tribes who on their reservation have fantastic environmental policies that yield good results for healthy forests and things like that, because if they don't, they pay the price. That's the contrast. And then we see it again and again, right? Jay Inslee's whole article is about politics and political symbolism, but if we actually care about the planet, what we care about is people on the ground making sure things work, and when they don't, saying, hey, why didn't this work? Let's make sure that it does. There is a very clear contrast between where the old school 1970s environmental movement is, which is that it has degenerated into political symbolism, and the new direction that we need to go that actually delivers environmental results, which is a market-based dynamic approach.
There's a question from Dan in our audience. He asks, what happened to the voter-approved requirement to have any new taxes go back to the voters for approval?
That was eliminated some time ago. So when an initiative is passed, for 2 years, it is protected. It can't be changed unless it's by a supermajority in the legislature. So that was passed a long time ago. That was removed. The legislature decided they didn't like the taxes going back. But what they did keep actually was, it did go to the ballot, but it was only advisory. And so then what would happen is that these taxes would go on the ballot, and the voters would say, yes, I like this, no, I don't. And you will not be shocked to find out that in the vast majority of those, the voters said, no, I don't like it. Even when some of the wording was really, truly remarkable, there was wording on one of them that it was, do you think we should tax, I think it was big oil or something like that, for something, childhood daycare. I mean, it was the most sort of friendly, type of tax and purpose. And people even voted against that. So getting tired of seeing that even as just an advisory vote, people were voting against them, the legislature then got rid of the advisory votes. So that's what they don't want to hear it from you anymore. They're tired. They don't like what you're saying. So, they got rid of those, unfortunately.
Yeah, they didn't want to change it to a suggestion vote because it just sounded too weak. So just get rid of it altogether. Makes it easier. One final question for you before we turn to Charles Prescrude, our Cole Center for Transportation Director, and that is on property taxes. There was the big the effort to raise the caps on increase in property taxes. We had 43,000 people sign up for that to speak against that when the hearing was there. Where did we land on property taxes for this legislative session so far with the governor? I mean, the governor could still do things, but so far.
So the worst form of that, which is to eliminate the 1% annual increase cap, didn't pass. There was one version of it that would allow like 8-9% increases per year because it was based on inflation plus a modifier and things like that. It would really have increased costs quite a bit. That did not pass. So what they did instead was sort of play a little trick, which is that they changed how school districts could calculate the property taxes and the amount that they could raise, which in effect ends up raising property or raises their ability to raise property taxes. So in individual school districts, you may still see property tax increases above what the level, above the 1%. It's rather complicated, and I will admit that I don't want to say much more than that because I'm probably getting it wrong already because it is very complicated, which is why they did it, right? They want to be able to say, no, we didn't raise property taxes. We made sure that schools got more money. That's all we did. So, so I think that those sorts of games get played, and so that is in there. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. One last thing I want to mention before.
Doesn't that also guarantee a McCleary problem too? Like, because it will inevitably create unequal school districts.
Correct. So for those who aren't familiar, the McCleary ruling basically said that it is unconstitutional to have some districts who pass all of their levies get a lot of money for schools, and then other districts who don't pass their levies have much lower level of funding, and that was unconstitutional. And so you had to have more state funding to even it out. The legislature, and the reason that they argued was that it was racist, right? That it was undermining school districts that had traditionally disadvantaged communities and preferencing, privileged communities and things like that. Ironically, the state legislature has now done the exact opposite and gone back to the system that they argued was racist and discriminatory and things like that. And they have put that system on steroids. So, they're trying to set up another lawsuit to force more funding. And the way that they're doing that is by saying, by passing a system they themselves say is discriminatory, in order so that they can come back and say, how did we get this system that is discriminatory? So it's, and of course, when this, sort of comes to fruition years from now, however many years from now, they will be able to, put their hand over their heart and say, we are outraged to find what has gone on here, when of course it is the intention of the system they have set up. Let me just add one more thing before we go on, before I will bring in Charles, which is that one of the things that we have focused on this year is to remove emergency clauses, unnecessary emergency clauses at the end of legislation. There are several reasons that you can have an emergency clause. The purpose, of course, is that if you have something that needs to take effect immediately, that is very important, that you put an emergency clause instead of waiting for 90 days after it's signed, that it takes effect either immediately or on a date that you set. There's a good example. In this session, they added an emergency clause to rules about how minors testify in court hearings. The purpose, it was passed unanimously. The purpose of that is they want it to take effect immediately so that you're not, having kids be put in these very uncomfortable, very traumatic situations in courtrooms, for another 3 months, just because that's the way it is. Great. I think that's a great use of the emergency clause. But what emergency clauses are also intended to do in some cases is to make it hard for the voters to vote. We just talked about the fact that the legislature doesn't like sometimes the way the voters vote. And so there are some bills that have emergency clauses because if a bill has an emergency clause, you can't put a referendum. In order to get a referendum, you need half the number of signatures as you would with an initiative. So it just creates a higher bar for the public to have their say. For instance, the Tesla tax that I just mentioned has an emergency clause. Why? Is it an emergency that Tesla, is selling these credits? No, of course not. The only reason is that they don't want Tesla and other electric car manufacturers and other folks putting a referendum on it because they know that there's going to be a lot of electric vehicle buyers and other folks who are mad at higher taxes. So they want to make it as hard for that to happen as possible. The repeal of the Parents' Bill of Rights, right, which many of these legislatures voted for a year ago and have now undone cynically or for whatever purpose. They put an emergency clause on that too. Why? Because they already know the voters want this because the voters got enough signatures to put it on the ballot the first time. And so they're trying to create that again. There's no emergency. There's no reason that it has to take effect now and not July 1st or, in July. The only reason they did that is to make it hard for the voters. So what we have encouraged the governor to do is to veto. He can use his section veto and veto those sections, get rid of the emergency clauses. He's already done it once this year, actually. So that's great news. Like he has already shown a willingness to see when emergency clauses are unnecessary or intended to block voters from having their say. He got rid of it. He should do that again.
That's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.